you taking the time to chat with me, dude. Yeah, and
for sure.
Definitely. Just for starters, man. Like, I don't want this to be like a journalistic kind of interview. I want this to be as fluid as possible. Like my intention of making this podcast is really just to have, meet cool people and have genuine conversations and try to, try to interact and delve a little bit deeper than the surface level stuff, and, have meaningful conversations about, life and how you choose to live your life and what you care about and that kind of stuff.
Cool.
Sound good? Cool, man. Awesome.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, for starters, dude, tell me a little bit about how you got into photography and ultimately why you decided to pursue it as a career.
So that's that's a big question. Actually, let me have some coffee.
Yeah, and also, if you need to go to the bathroom or take a break at any point, let me know. It's all good.
We can record all this. This can all be part of the podcast, by the way. It's
yeah, sweet.
Actually, here, you're with me for my I actually think you could learn a lot about somebody from their morning routine, especially the vitamins that they take. And a lot of somebody's personal history is written in the vitamins that they take. So here, let's go through this. Multivitamin, because I want to be healthy. Fish oil. Amazing. For brain health, for focus. I have extreme ADHD. Okay, let's put those down.
Love it.
And a big jug of water with apple cider vinegar because I have Ashkenazi Jewish digestive system. Apple cider vinegar helps.
Great, man. Great.
Lion's mane mushrooms for, again, focus, ADHD. Ashwagandha with maca root for mood and energy. Vitamin B2, 400 milligrams. My neurologist recommended this. I had a bad motorcycle accident and a brain injury. So
oh, wow.
That's a whole part of the story from the past, but we'll get into that. That's why I said the history is written into it. Vitamin D, this is my sunshine drug. I need sunshine. I have a little, you can see a little happy lamp over here. That's my apples with peanut butter. Recommend that for anybody who lives in a cold and dark climate in the winter. It's really good for your mood. You wake up in the morning, you get some natural UV. And biotin. I think this is for somebody, a pharmacist in Colombia recommended I get this. Colombia, the country, not the university. When I was buying vitamin D. He was like, it's good for your bones and your hair. All right, so let me just take this, get my energy up, and then we'll get started.
Sweet, man. I should have brought my vitamins. I took them like 20 minutes ago.
Jack, what do you take every day? What's your routine?
I do vitamin C.
Mm-hmm.
I do vitamin D, fish oil for like the same reasons that you've already given. And then I also take this, I take a probiotic because I have some gut issues.
Yeah.
And then I also take this pill called quercetin. That's like, cool. It helps with inflammation also because of drug issues, and apparently helps with longevity and that kind of stuff.
Nice. Okay. All right. I'll look into it.
Yeah.
Cool. Great. So your question. Where are you based, by the way, Jack?
Yeah, dude, I'm in Williamsburg. What about yourself?
Oh, I'm in Bushwick. Okay. Yeah. So how did I get into photography? So I guess you got to go way back. My grandfather, who was a physician, there's a photo of him right here. Actually, both my grandparents were physicians. She was the only, this is in their place in Puerto Rico. She was the only female graduate of her entire medical school class in the 40s, 2 immigrants in the 40s. When women weren't going to college in New York, typically, she was graduating medical school. He was also a physician, dermatologist, pediatrician. So he was a photographer as a hobbyist. They were humanists. They traveled the world and through a very kind of like humanistic lens. It wasn't just about tourists. It was about getting to know the people and the things and in the places that they would go. And they would always when they would travel with my mom when she was younger, she was very privileged. My mom was the youngest out of three kids, and she was 7 and 10 years younger than her two older siblings. So she basically just got to tag along on all these adventures that my grandparents had. Um,
Nice.
and again, these very like firsthand experiences where they were not just focused on being tourists, but really focused on immersing themselves within the places that they would go. Um, and my grandfather always had a camera with him. He was a photography hobbyist, but he took some amazing photos, and I grew up with his photos. Going to their house and seeing his photos from all over the world on the wall, and they were great. And my mom's two older siblings were doctors, so they took after that side of their parents. And my mom is a photographer, so she took after the hobbyist part from her dad. My grandmother wasn't interested in photography at all as a hobby; she just enjoyed it. Um, and my grandfather, um, he introduced me to photography kind of like as a practice very young. He and my grandmother were actually the first ones to put a camera in my hand. My mom always had a camera in her hand, but she wasn't really showing me how to operate a camera. I just kind of, learned by diffusion with her. But um, my grandfather took me to trips. My grandparents took me on trips, and they bought me my first camera, a Minolta film camera, um, and I still have it lying around somewhere. I should actually probably find it. It's probably at my mom's house, but I uh, I I remember going to a Robert Capa exhibit with my grandfather. He was a really famous war photographer.
Mm.
Um, if you ask me, who are three people, dead or alive, who you'd like to have dinner with, I think it would be probably all at the same time, because I think the three of them would get along really well. I think it'd probably be Robert Capa, Anthony Bourdain, and Frida Kahlo. Um, I think that'd be a really
That's
fun
awesome.
trio. Um, well, and me included. So the four of us. Um, so he took me to see this Robert Capa exhibit, and I kind of just like fell in love with this idea of experiencing the world through the camera from a very young age. And then it kind of just like sat in the back of my head. And this person of Robert Capa was kind of like this character. He became like a kind of like a superhero to me when my other superheroes at that age were like, you know, Charles Oakley and Patrick Ewing and Anthony Mason. This photographer who was, going behind enemy lines in World War II, was a Jew from Hungary, spoke seven languages, um, had this life of adventure and intrigue and making really powerful photos that changed minds. That kind of gave me the bug from the start. And it always kind of lived in the back of my mind. I guess I never really thought of it as a clear vocation. And then I spent the early part of my career, my 20s and 30s, working in a variety of industries. I've had a few different careers and paths, but all of them, my camera was with me. Um, and I was kind of experiencing my work through photography as a separate kind of path. So, like I mentioned, I went to, or I had a head injury. I was in medical school when I was younger, in my early 20s. And I had a bad motorcycle accident, hit my head. And after a year of trying to recover and never really being able to fully recover, I basically said, I'm not going to be able to make medicine work, because my brain just never responded cognitively to the way I needed it to be able to continue with medical school afterwards. And
Wow.
admittedly, medical school was really hard for me. It wasn't the path that I should have chosen for myself.
Mm.
I was never a strong science student or a math student, but the behavior of, essentially like whatever like privilege we might have had to positively affect the world around us and the world at large, I'd always seen that behavior modeled through medicine. Um, like I said, my grandparents were physicians. Both my mom's older siblings are physicians, and they're both married to physicians. My dad is a physician. and now my younger brother's a physician. So
Mhm.
I'd always seen their kind of like innate ability to change lives on a very acute, direct level. And I said, I want to positively impact people's lives. This is the most direct route to do it. Very vertical route. You're dealing with individual patients. And then when I left medical school, it was kind of the circuitous route. I did a few different things, worked in media, worked for a bunch of nonprofits in the developing world, um, and in Latin America and India and the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I always had my camera with me and I was documenting the work where it was, ethically appropriate to document the work through photos. And I think photography was becoming more of a part of my life, I guess, in parallel with how photography was becoming more a part of everybody's lives.
Mhm.
Um, with the advent of social media and digital media, photography just became so much more of a medium for communication than it used to be. I mean, we can all identify the biggest global conflicts or the biggest global events from the past 100 years, and you can kind of tell their story with one or two photos. You think of these as part of like the overall societal psyche. You think of Vietnam, you think of the girls running away, basically running away from a village on fire. You think of World War II, you think of the D-Day photos. You think of JFK's assassination. You remember the photo of his son. I think he was saluting or something like that. But now we're just so saturated. So um, I think photography's become even more part of it. But it's harder to identify like what is the canonical photo um, for each situation. That's a separate conversation. But I started eventually I kind of like made my way back. I started thinking again about like how do I accomplish the goals that I set out to accomplish while I was, that made me decide to go into medicine. How do I essentially accomplish those goals through other means? And I started looking at the organizations that do more horizontal work, um, and what the leaders in these organizations, what their personal profiles look like. Um, so I went to grad school, University of Miami, for international relations, and after that, I joined the Brookings Institution on a graduate internship. And I had been working for a medical aid organization that called Global Medical Training that runs medical aid missions with pre-med and medical and pre-dental and dental students in Latin America and India. And then I joined the Brookings Institution as a graduate intern. And after 6 months, they hired me full time to stay. I think I kind of brought something that was a little bit different than like the classic academic researcher on like a PhD track. I had a lot more practical experience. So I wasn't an expert at anything that Brookings did. I wasn't an expert researcher. I wasn't an expert, in comms. I wasn't an expert in fundraising, but I had the ability to do all of those things really well. Um, so I just kind of kept getting plugged into different places. And then the pandemic hit, and we started working from home. And I was working from home in DC, and then concurrently, George Floyd had been murdered. And, DC was kind of like a hotbed of protest and of discourse. It was also coinciding with the election, and there was so much going on with the way Trump was responding to the Black Lives Matter movement and this whole movement. So DC became a real center for it. And my girlfriend, my now ex-girlfriend, and I lived, she actually worked for the federal government. She and I lived a mile up from the White House, exactly 1 mile, because it was on my running route. um, so there would be these big protests that go down 14th Street. um, Almost at a certain point, it became almost every day, towards the White House. 14th Street is kind of like this historical center that goes through U Street and then goes through a bunch of different neighborhoods, kind of part of the the history of like Black DC. It has a very important role. So um, a lot of important protests happen around like 14th Street and U Street in DC, and we lived at 14th Street and R Street, so it just goes down. And the White House is at 16th and H, basically 16th and Pennsylvania. So that gives you an indication of how close it was to us. So finish work around 5-ish, 6-ish every day, and that's when people would be finishing up work and just marching down towards the White House every day. So I would go and either go on a run and bring my small camera or my phone, or just go out, and once I saw or heard people protesting, I'd go out and I'd bring my camera with me and just kind of document it. I mean, I was involved in the protests as a as a protester, but also as a photographer. And June 1st, 2020, I see a protest going down 14th Street. I join it, or I was actually finishing up a meeting, so I was like, all right, they must be going down to the White House because there was a lot. And my meeting finished late. I put on my running shoes and I like ran down to the White House as fast as I could. I remember like tracking my run on Nike, and it was like one of the fastest miles that I'd run like all year, if not ever, because I knew there was something happening. So I wanted to get down there as quickly as possible. So I ran down to the White House. It was a huge protest that day, June 1st. Um, and you could just tell there was some like extra tension in the air. There was a lot of National Guardsmen were there. There were all these different kind of like federal um, law enforcement agencies there. Like ATF was there, FBI was there, and they're in their full riot gear and everything. And it was generally a peaceful protest. I mean, protesters had generally like taken over kind of that park in front of the White House. That then they put up a big fence in front of it. But I was kind of like in as a photographer, I was in like protester slash observer mode, and I started to notice that something was happening because I noticed all like the big political figures starting to show up, like Milley and the other guy with the glasses. I can't remember his name. Trump fired him soon thereafter, or he quit soon thereafter. Whoever it was, he had so many um, defense secretaries and national security advisors that it's hard to keep track. Um, but at a certain point, Trump decided that he wanted to give um, a speech. So he had basically the National Guard clear out all of these peaceful protesters with tear gas and rubber bullets, so that he could walk across the street to that church. And he gave that famous speech with the upside down Bible. And I was in the crowd and I got tear gassed. I still have the canister somewhere. I don't know where it is right now, but like the tear gas canister, it's like this big. We turned it into a planter. Um,
Nice.
and then and I got a lot of photos that day. And then my friend told me knew that I was there, and she had a friend at the ACLU who's started building a case against the Trump administration for essentially brutalizing and firing on peaceful protesters for no reason other than to have. I mean, the reason doesn't matter, but his reason was to do this, press conference in front of this church where he held the Bible upside down. He just held up the Bible like this, like he was the second coming of Jesus. And I got connected with the ACLU. I shared some of my photos and my video, and the ACLU told me they were working with Vice News on a story. So I shared some of my work with Vice News. They liked my work, and then they used a lot of my photos in a documentary that they did on the the protest on June 1st. It was called The Photo Op. That's what the name of the documentary was. Check it out. Um, and At that point, and they interviewed me for the documentary also. And at that point, I started to realize that, like, if I lean into photography a little bit more, that there's something here, and that I'm accomplishing the same sort of goals that I wanted to accomplish with working at the Brookings Institution and working in medicine, which is basically just like positively affecting society in a way that I felt most connected to, in a way that I could contribute the most, my skill set or my experience. So I started at that point, kind of like the idea really entered into my head where maybe I could do this more seriously. And I started to kind of like take, small steps. I started, learning a little bit more about photography, buying better equipment, um, putting myself strategically in the right places at the right times to be able to, capture the right stories. Um, and a series of life events put me in a position where I was finally like really able to make a concrete decision that I would just kind of leave what I was doing behind and go into photography. And that was, my girlfriend and I had broken up and we had our apartment together in DC, and the lease ended. So all of a sudden I, didn't have to pay rent in a specific city, and I was single, so only for myself. And I over the next like 2 years, I left DC. In a year and a half, I was living in like 10 or 15 different countries, just working remotely, doing some consulting, working for an organization that essentially does like an Aspen Ideas, Davos style meetings all over the world off the record. And our entire team was remote. So I could do that from anywhere. So I lived in Argentina, Colombia, Costa Rica, Tel Aviv, Italy, um, New York, DC, um, a bunch of other places in between. Um, and at a certain point, I was doing a lot more photography, but I was so spread thin, and I was so like, I was all over the place, and I couldn't really like make anything of the photography, because everybody I met with was like, you really need to like plant yourself somewhere and focus on a specific theme. And I decided, like I need some. I started to figure out how little I actually know about photography, about the technical side of it, about the business side of it, about the practice of it. So, I said to myself, why don't I try to go and get some actual, meaningful training about this? Because if I want to go for it, I want to go all the way. I don't want to half-ass it. So I looked at a few like different intensive photography programs. One of them was with Magnum and Speos in Paris, and another one was the International Center of Photography in New York City. And I had a few friends of friends who had done the International Center of Photography program. It's basically like um, a year long intensive in either documentary photography or creative practices in photography. Creative is a bit more technical, more artistic, and documentary is much more based on like long form storytelling, journalism, the type of stuff that I'm more interested in. Um, and I got a nice chunk of money to go attend a director's fellowship, and I just said, fuck it, I'm going to pull the trigger and do it. I actually remember I submitted my application to this program. I do everything last minute, which is a problem, but I submitted my application the night that I got to Argentina. I think it was March 1st, and the deadline was 12 a.m. or 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and Argentina was 2 hours ahead. So it was my first night in Argentina in Buenos Aires, and I sat at a bar to kind of like submit it at maybe like 8 o'clock, thinking about like I do the last hour or two, finish my edits, and submit it, by like 10 o'clock. And I just kept getting more ideas and more things that I wanted to talk about in my personal statement. I literally submitted it. The bar had closed, but the Wi-Fi was still on, and I didn't even have time to walk home. I submitted my application at like 1:59 a.m. and 35 seconds, like with 15 seconds to spare. Um, and A few months later, I found out that I got in, and I got a nice chunk of funding, and I just said like, all right, fuck it, all signs point back to New York. And I've been in this program since August. It's one of the best personal and professional decisions I've made for myself. There is so much that I discovered that I did not know about photography, about the technical side of it, about the practice of it, the history of it, how to just go about it. Um, And it's been a huge gift to be able to be back in New York, where most of my family is, and experience this place that I know so well, kind of anew through the camera. Um, and since August, I've also had the opportunity to go to a few interesting places and cover really important stories, I guess you could say, or important events. Um, and yeah, that leads us here, January 27th, 28th, whatever date it is today.
Amazing, man. Yeah, and I definitely want to spend some time, maybe in the second half of this, to discuss the trip that you went on recently. We'll spend a bunch of time talking about that. So you mentioned Robert Capa. I'm curious, and I guess before I jump into that, so do you consider yourself like a photojournalist, a more artistic photographer, or somebody who engages more in, like, I guess, more long form kind of documentary stuff? Like, what have you kind of decided a concentration? Do you do everything? What's your cup of tea?
Yeah. So, I mean, I start like what I was like talking about before with like the Vice News stuff. That is much more photojournalism, and like a big kind of theme that we talk about at ICP is what's the difference between photojournalism and documentary photography. And photojournalism is much more like, the way I think about it, this might not be the traditional definition, but having done photojournalism and having done documentary photography, photojournalism is more reactive, and documentary photography, I would say, is more proactive. So photojournalism is more, like I said, there's something happening, go shoot it, go cover it.
Yeah.
It's more about, like, this situation is going on, let's react to it, quick analysis, share the story, report on it quickly. Documentary photography to me is more, it's definitely more long form, and it's about there's this long, deep story that you want to tell. It's much more than surface level. It's not just it's not reportage. It's more expose, I guess you could say. I wish there were a less pretentious word for that. But it's more deep learning, I guess you could say. I mean, and that to me is much more what I'm interested in, because it allows you to immerse yourself in a story. It allows you to immerse yourself into relationships with the subjects. It also allows you to take and um, a more personal, and I guess you could say it is at the same time inherently biased, but I think it's more overt, and you can be a little bit more. Um, you can it gives you the space to kind of talk about how you yourself, given your own experience and your own bias, relates to what you're seeing and what you're learning about. Whereas reportage is, you're not going to see on like an A1 New York Times cover story, you're not going to see the writer talk about how the experience affected them given their specific set of circumstances, or what their preconceived notions about a certain situation were. It's more just, this happened, these are the facts, move on to the next article. Um, and I think that's how you would differentiate between documentary and photojournalism. So I've definitely done more photojournalistic work, but I am much more interested in the documentary side of photography, telling deeper, more long form stories that really change minds, not just reporting, which is extremely important. But I'm more interested in the long form storytelling.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, and I studied anthropology undergrad, so I kind of like look at my work as, sorry, um,
Good.
I look at my work through like a very um, well. People are starting, when they see more of my work, they recognize as kind of like humanistic, um, anthropological approach, where it's trying to have like a deep understanding and empathy. Um, so I'm most interested in people, and I think kind of like my experience and course of study actually, though very circuitous, and I wish I had decided to get into photography earlier, it informs my work in a way that I feel really lucky to have had all of these sets of experiences, to be able to kind of like understand better and approach people through a lens of understanding and empathy and kind of like this deep, sociocultural toolkit that I have developed from working all over the world from a lot of different populations and, having studied anthropology and international relations. So I think that affects my photographic work in a unique way.
What has photography taught you about people, and has it taught you anything like fundamentally new?
Yeah, I mean, I've learned. I guess I could say I've been surprised by how useful photography can be as a bridge and how useful it can be as a form of empathy. The camera is agnostic, and the camera can be, it can be used for, it can be used for, for negative purposes as well. But um, you can really use it as a means for good. Um, and I think, uh, people respond to you differently when you are making photos as a photographer than just as a person. If they genuinely feel like they're being seen, and if they're allowed to kind of like share their true selves through a lens, then I think it inherently kind of like breaks down this exterior that people have, um, and it allows you to kind of like start a conversation. So for me, I'm most interested in people and learning about people, and the camera is a way to kind of like break down that barrier and allow people to feel genuinely seen, and allow them to feel like they can be their authentic and more raw selves. So I think not just the act of photography, but kind of like the camera itself and the relationship between, a subject and having their photo taken, or a subject and a photographer, gives me access that I hadn't had just in trying to have conversations with people.
Yeah.
So the camera as kind of like a conversation starter, and then, vis-a-vis allowing that to be like a bridge and a way to create empathy, has been a real kind of like learning experience. And because of that, I have my camera with me at all times, 100% of the time. Um, and something that I learned, or not I learned, but something that, we talked about like pretty early on in my time at ICP. I can't remember which photographer said this. I can probably find it out, but basically said that nobody gets into photography, or especially not, excuse me, especially not documentary photography, because they love photography itself, because they love the technical aspects of photography itself. They get into photography because they're passionate about something else, and they express that passion through photography. And that really resonated with me, because I love photographing and I love seeing photographs, but at the same time, just for photography's sake, to me, it's just another art form. But being able to use photography to learn about people, to learn about the world, to create, these bridges of empathy and understanding, that's what I love about it. So I'm passionate and interested in people and in culture and in conflict resolution, and and building bridges and food and music and personal identities and culture. And I use the camera to experience and share all of this, and I use photography to essentially pursue and share the things that I'm most passionate about. And I think everybody does that to a certain extent. Every photographer does that to a certain extent. They figure out what they're most passionate about, and at a certain point they say to kind of go after and share this passion with the world.
Yeah. You mentioned that you've traveled quite a bit, and I mean, a big part of your like your interest and your passion is learning about people across different cultures.
Yeah.
Have there been any trips that have fundamentally changed the way that you saw the world after experiencing these trips?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, um, I studied abroad in college in I did a global health. It's called Health, Culture, and Community, and it was through the International Honors Program, School for International Training, and I studied abroad in Tanzania and Vietnam.
Mm.
It was kind of like
Wow.
a cross cultural comparison between different health systems, and most of my friends were going. I went to Boston University undergrad, and BU has a big, you know, big broad series of study abroad programs in cities like Rome and Paris and London, and I wanted to do something a bit different and really learn and experience something different, because to be honest with you, I didn't really feel like I was getting that in most of my classes until I started taking anthropology and global health classes, um, and um, it was made up of students from all over the country, really all over the world. And we did homestays wherever we were. And so I had a homestay in Tanzania and a homestay in Vietnam. And in between, we spent a week. About 8 of us spent a week in Ethiopia with one of my friends who was going to college in the States, but is from Addis Ababa and is back there right now, or he's been back there since he graduated college. He's building a hospital with his mom. And we spent some time in Ethiopia too, and Vietnam and Tanzania living with families. And it was just such a important educational, personal, um, cultural experience living within these cultures. I had host brothers and host sisters who were my age, so really getting to see how they live their lives, being included with their friends, having dinner with them every night, and allowing myself to be immersed fully in the culture and in their families, because in their way of life, because there was really no other choice. It just basically like further reinforced my belief that people are inherently similar, that the values are generally the same across cultures, that people value security and family and education and happiness. The ideas of happiness are different and based on different material things in different places, but it kind of solidified my belief that like in what really matters, and that you can be happy with any level of material goods or items, as long as like the real richness in life comes from family and sharing experiences and food and art and learning, not from the more material things that we kind of define as success and happiness in the States. And it kind of like reframed the way I think about like what's important to me, um, because I saw just happiness and sustainability modeled in such different ways, versus like how I grew up in New York and New Jersey, which like the definitions of success and happiness are much more rigid and capitalistic, I guess you could say. um, and yeah, that kind of, I guess, solidified the belief that I could make my career work no matter what it's in, and I don't need to pursue a career that is going to give me the same sort of, I guess you could say, like creature comforts that people tend to go after, or that I even grew up with. So it allowed me kind of like the space to be, um, to pursue the things that I felt were more important to me, on a base level, I guess you could say.
Very cool. You mentioned Robert Capa as being like one of your biggest inspirations early on. I'm curious, what do you think makes what makes Robert Capa such a well regarded documentary photographer? And I'm also curious, like, what are your favorite photos of his and why?
Yeah, so I think it's like, I don't think people would say this, but I think it's really his like, he had this kind of like, um, this boldness. Everybody would define it differently. This boldness, this bravery, this brashness, this carelessness, this maybe even stupidity, where he basically like lived his life without much of a plan. He was a very he was extremely gregarious. I think he was so successful not because he was such a brilliant photographer, but because of his ability to connect with people. People loved him, and I think that was way more important to him having the impact that he had as a photographer than his photographs themselves. And actually, probably his best photographs were actually ruined. Most of his photographs from D-Day, where he literally jumped off one of the U-boats um, into the water with one of the first waves of American soldiers. He jumped into the water with them, and he sent his negatives back to his film back to Life magazine, and some staff member um, fucked up the negatives or fucked up the film, and most of his film from D-Day was destroyed. And his photos from D-Day, which still ended up being some of the most photos from D-Day, were probably his worst photos from that day. They're very blurry, but the blurriness works because it kind of just like speaks to the overall psyche of that day and that whole situation. But um, he was a real romantic. He was a Renaissance man. He spoke 7 or 8 different languages. There's only one known recording that I could find of him actually speaking, and he has this extremely unique voice and accent. And people who knew him actually say he spoke Capanese,
Mm.
because he would just basically like code switch and switch languages all the time to confuse people and to kind of like navigate through the world. His real name was Andre Fleischmann, I believe. So he was also like a Jewish person behind enemy lines during World War II from Budapest. And his brother actually started the International Center of Photography, where I'm studying now, Cornell Capa, who was a brilliant photographer himself. Um, and he dated um, actresses, like Hollywood actresses and models, and was friends with Ernest Hemingway. And he was also very idealistic about his work, which I think is what made him such a strong photographer. Is that if he thought there was a story worth covering, he would just essentially like decide for himself to go do it. So he covered, some of the most important stories: the Spanish Civil War, um, World War II, and he would basically parachute in behind enemy lines in Italy, and would be in these very difficult places. And he also elevated other photographers, Gerda Taro, and um, he he didn't really like take no for an answer. He kind of just did it his own way, and didn't ask for permission. He asked for forgiveness, and at basically any time where he took the risk and said like, I'm going to bet on myself and figure it out. His photos, ended up being, impactful and brilliant, brilliant photos. And I really think he loved and enjoyed his life, and it was an adventure for him. He wrote a book about it, which is one of the most interesting and fun books I've ever read. It's called Slightly Out of Focus, um, which I think he probably thought would end up being a Hollywood movie played by, you know, famous Hollywood star, because he kind of writes it like it's an adventure novel, but it's historical fiction, nonfiction about his time photographing World War II. Highly recommend it. But to me, it's just like his bravery and his dedication to telling the story at great harm and great risk to himself. And he's also just a fascinating character who did things his own way and never really took no for an answer.
Does he have, aside from maybe the D-Day photos that you mentioned, are there any photos that he has produced, or honestly, any other photographer has produced that you think like, perfectly encapsulates like the ideal of what like documentary photography, is maybe on like a more humanistic level?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, Kappa's most famous photograph is famous because it's probably like the most oft debated photo about whether or not it's actually real or stage. It's the photo.
Mm.
It's called the falling soldier. It's a photo of a soldier essentially falling back, purportedly right after he got shot, um, and nobody really knows. But there's been a debate since the photo was taken about whether or not it was staged or a real photo. Just even if you search Robert Capa photos, that's probably the first photo that would come up. I don't really think there's one particular photo as like documentaries, but I think um, it's more about like the photographer's whole body of work themselves, because like one photo can't really stand alone. Like I was can't even remember who I was listening to the other day. Maybe it was Fred Richin, who's a mentor of mine. I think it might have been him. He was talking about, one photo is like, a shutter speed is like, let's say 1/1000th or 1/100th of a second, depending on the light. So that's all you're really seeing of a specific situation. So it would take 100 to 1,000 photos to tell the story of just 1 second of time. So we also need to be very careful about allowing photos to really like stand as a story on their own. They need to be more deeply informed with context. I think we lose that a lot, and context is extremely important. Um, which is why I tend to like gravitate more towards documentary photography, because it gives you the space to kind of like frame things on a more deeper, holistic level. But there's certain, I guess, photographers that you could say, even who are documentary photographers, who really, or photojournalists who really do a good job of telling the human side of the story. I love Lindsay Adario's work. She wrote an amazing book called It's What I Do. She's an incredibly brave photographer, um, and she captures really human stories, even just in her photojournalism work. There's a photographer based in Brooklyn named Natalie Kesar, who I really admire. She's worked a lot in Ukraine, and even when she does stories, photo stories that are in New York, they're very um, deeply humanistic and very deeply impactful, and tell a real, um, I guess you could say, human and um, empathetic story. Um, and I could go on and on. I mean, Salgado, I love his work. There's a lot of photographers now who are working in Israel and Palestine whose work I really admire. Uh, Oren Zeev, even Motaz Aziza, just for putting his life on the line, and exposing what's happening. Um, there's a photographer named Avishag. I can't remember her last name. She has two hyphenated last names, but her work's been really fantastic. And I don't think you can. I think work that you can't use as propaganda, when it comes to news, is really powerful. And I think those photographers do a good job of that.
Amazing. Yeah, it's funny you brought up Robert Capa. I when designing my website for this podcast, I for the main page I use this photo of it's a photo of soldiers storming the beach in Normandy, and it's like blurry and it's gray, and it like shows you, I mean, it depicts like the chaos of that environment. Like there's a darkness, there's a chaos, it takes you kind of to this other world where I don't know what it was like there, but you at least feel something. You feel something different
Right.
than maybe you would when you see soldiers on, the TV or something like that. Um, yeah, big Robert Kappa fan. Also, I like Tim Hetherington a lot.
Yeah, Tim Harrington's amazing.
He's amazing. Yeah, I went to the Bronx Documentary Center like 2 months ago, and they had one of his books on the Liberian Civil War. I forget the name of it, but it kind of displayed. And man, he has a photo. He has a photo where there's this kind of like rebel soldier kind of embracing, like leaning over what appears to be his girlfriend, and there's like a look in her eyes, like it's the last time she's ever going to see him again. He kind of knows it as well, and like that, those kind of photos take you somewhere else.
For sure.
They transport you to something. It's like it's just you understand what despite the culture, the conflict, whatever. It's like everybody can kind of understand what's happening right here. It's so human. It's so like fundamental.
Yeah,
That's cool, man.
exactly.
Awesome. I'm also curious. You know, what is your process like? Like when you're thinking about kind of more long term projects. You know, I know you're attracted to kind of more humanistic stuff, but like, how do you engage in that? Do you kind of plan stuff out and try certain ideas out, or do you kind of just put yourself in different scenarios and kind of go with the flow and let it take you where it goes?
Yeah, definitely the latter. Um, and I think probably the deeper I get into this world of documentary photography, that actually might shift to the former. Um, I haven't worked with many editors, so the work that I've done is self-directed, self-guided typically, and then it ends up wherever it ends up afterwards. I've never been a staff photographer for anybody, so I've never had an editor, or I've never worked with a writer that said, you know, we need you to cover this specific thing. It's always been, you know, I'm going to put myself in this situation, cover what I think the story is. The story usually ends up being something else. Things kind of materialize, and then that work, you know, shows up somewhere. It makes things more difficult because you never really know what's happening going in, and it makes it more interesting at the same time because it allows you this flexibility to discover while you're there. And when I was in um, you know, Israel this past month, that's exactly what happened. Went in with a very open mind. Basically just said, you know, as a photographer, I don't know what I'm going to see. I want to cover a very broad story and hear as many people's experiences as possible from every different, you know, walk of life, demographic, and cover it that way, and allowing myself to be open, and be democratic about that process and about the story, I think opened a lot of doors for me. And I think in general, that's really my approach, is that like really being open and acknowledging my bias, but leaving that out so that, you know, the stories can essentially come to me.
Mm.
It's really try not to force any work. If you feel like you have to like force a story, then it's not really a story. I think that's a problem that a lot of like journalism these days ends up with. It's that, you know, they go into it wanting to tell a specific story, so there's this like confirmation bias that's inherent in a lot of the work. um, and you know, like my work, like I just approach it with like I want to like challenge regular ideas, and you know, news and media is extremely polarized and extremely polarizing. And to me, like I will say like that's my agenda. Like I think every photographer is a human being and has an agenda and has an angle. Like for me, my like actual agenda is to share authentic stories, to prove that cultures and groups of people are not monolithic, um, and to kind of like break down these silos of polarization that we live in now. And you know, what I've experienced in the past, especially with this current conflict, and what I've experienced, you know, being in the middle of politics and media, in the States in the past, you know, 10 or so years, is people tend to just engage with ideas and news outlets and people who only reinforce the ideas that they already have established. And my agenda as a photographer is to allow people to to have those ideas be challenged in a way that they might not necessarily realize, because if they realize that their ideas are going to be challenged from the start, they just won't engage. So I try to tell stories that are more agnostic and democratic, where people don't feel like um, they're being, you know, any narrative is being pushed on them, where they're feeling like, you know, they're not feeling like they're they're being told anything, where they're allowed to kind of like discover it by themselves, and they learn something new, and they can maybe create like new pathways of empathy with each other. And that was kind of my goal for this, Israel Palestine body of work that I did just now.
Awesome, man. So before we get into that, I definitely have a bunch of questions about that. I'm gonna use the restroom. Take like 3 minutes, and then
Yeah,
we'll get back into
take the
it.
time.
Appreciate it, man.
Yeah.
Give me a sec. We are back. Let's make sure the mic is good. Let's see. Yeah. Awesome. Cool, man. So tell me a little bit about, you spent several weeks, I believe, in Poland and in Israel, Palestine. Tell me about your trip, and maybe start off like, what was the intention of this trip, and kind of walk me through, what you experienced in each of these locations.
Sure. So I actually started out in I went to Poland for about a week beforehand to basically my it started with Poland. So I have my dad's parents are Holocaust survivors from. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
I can hear you great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool.
There's not too much background noise for you.
No,
Okay.
totally good.
Um, so my dad's parents are Holocaust survivors from Poland, and we grew up listening to my grandfather's stories. My grandmother didn't talk about it much. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, and my grandmother is my dad's mom is my last living grandparent. And basically, I'm very conscious that the living memory of this very important um, time in history is going to disappear within the next few years, and it's incredibly relevant to today. I think that time in history, and I think we are slowly, or in my community, feel slowly, but I feel like the rest of the world very rapidly, the dangers of the type of rhetoric that we see in the world and the type of politics that we're seeing in the world today, and how quickly we can slip into a situation like that again. Um, and So I wanted to go there and just kind of like experience my grandparents, my grandfather's footsteps before World War II. So I went there without much of a plan other than knowing the village that my grandfather grew up in. Um, I had memoirs and I had old photos. And I'm getting Polish citizenship now, so I have all of these old documents that I had uncovered with the help of a Polish law firm, search firm. Um, so I went to my grandfather's village, and all that's left of the Jewish community, which was like 60% of the town, like 6,400 Jews, something like that, in 1939. Now the population is zero. All that's left is a small cemetery that I had to hop over a fence to get to, and it's in between an apartment building and a highway and a factory. Um, and I went to Auschwitz, where my uncle Heshi's family was. Um, and just to kind of like experience it and share this work. And I'm still, to be honest with you, not sure exactly how I'm going to be sharing it, or what the exact story is, or how I want to like frame it. If it's a story for me, or if it's a story for, you know, my my family, or if it's a story for my culture, if it's a story for society at large. I don't really know. So after Poland, I went to Israel, and I wanted to go on October 8th. But my advisor, Karen Marshall, wonderful photographer and mentor, basically said, don't go to Israel right away. There's photographers there who are covering the conflict, and there's going to be enough, you know, based on the response in New York to share. And I think your voice is more important, your photographic voice, your approach to photography and documentary photography is more important to have in New York right now. So I really took that to heart, and I photographed. I mean, I didn't sleep because it's a very personal issue for me, but I photographed every major pro-Palestine protest, pro-Israel protest while I was in New York. And it was a really hard and frustrating experience because I feel like there's a lot of um, misinformation on both sides about, what's actually happening or the resolutions for what people are calling for. And I fully appreciate anybody's, reason to be pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. To me, I think to be pro-Israeli, you have to be pro-Palestinian people. And to be pro-Palestinian people, you have to be pro-Israeli people too. There's two groups of people who live side by side. History as to how we got here aside, these two groups of people aren't going anywhere. And in order for each group to feel, secure and safe, their neighbors also need to feel secure and safe. And if they don't, then the fangs are going to come out from either side. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is that when you threaten somebody's safety, they go on the attack. Threaten somebody's well-being, threaten somebody's ability to live with equality or dignity, they're going to go on the attack, and people are going to suffer. So that's what's happening. So it was always kind of like after October 7th, I was just watching the situation very closely, and it's a situation, very, um, close to my heart. I've lived in Israel. I have Israeli friends. I have, you know, um, my two best friends live in Israel, in Tel Aviv. And I have a lot of Palestinian friends, and I have a lot of Muslim friends, and I have a lot of Arab friends and Jewish friends from all over the world. And for us, um, it's a very palpable part of our psyche on any given day. And by us, I mean all of the people I just mentioned, but especially since this latest war started, it's extremely personal. Um, and it's a story. Everybody has a very personal story as it relates to this. So I wanted to go to Israel and essentially um, combat those issues that I said earlier that have been made really acute in this conflict, specifically the polarization, the misinformation, the idea that communities are just monolithic. Um, so I wanted to go there and basically tell as broadcast a wide of a net as possible in terms of who I interviewed, who I spoke to, and who I photographed. Um, and that was my sole idea with going there. I didn't know what type of access I would had. I'd reached out to a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals before I had gone to just get information and see where I might be able to photograph. But until I got there, I didn't really know what kind of access I was going to get or who I was going to speak to. And I was only planning on spending 7 or 8 days there. I was flying in on the 24th and was coming back on January 1st or 2nd. I ended up staying until January 15th because I just kept finding more stories worth telling, more people whose experience I needed to hear, who I thought would be helpful in creating these like bridges of understanding and empathy for anybody involved in this conflict. And I wanted to make it as democratic as possible so that nobody feels like it's against them. That even if it's somebody that comes from the opposite side of the political or religious spectrum from them, that they see them as a human being with a real set of experiences that are worthy of the beliefs that they have, and that they don't have these ideas and beliefs out of hate. They have them out of a specific set of experiences. So that ended up taking me from, the kibbutzim, the villages that were attacked by Hamas on October 7th, completely destroyed on the border with Gaza, to, the area where their survivors are staying, to speaking with, Israelis who had their friends and family, murdered in front of their eyes and kidnapped, and are some of whom are still in Gaza, to um, Palestinian and Israeli peace activists who are working together, who have been working together for years on creating resolutions, to the Druze community, who is a community of very kind of like secretive incredibly welcoming, incredibly patriotic community. Druze is kind of like an offshoot of Islam. Their patron, or their prophet, is Jethro, Moses's father-in-law, and they're kind of like an offshoot of Islam. They speak Arabic at home. So they're also kind of like caught in between a few worlds. There's large populations in Syria, Lebanon, even in Canada, but they're incredibly patriotic as one of their virtues, as one of their core beliefs to whatever country they are in. Um, so um, I spent a lot of time in the Druze communities also. I spoke with religious and secular Jews, right wing, left wing, um, Palestinian activists, everyday Palestinians, uh, Ethiopian Israelis, Mizrahi Israelis, Ashkenazi Israelis, um, young Palestinians, old Palestinians, um, soldiers, civilians, um, young, old, um, Christian, Arab, Jewish, Muslim, Israeli, Palestinian, Latino, Russian, Ethiopian, refugee, um, anybody who has an experience um, worth sharing, and that's anybody's experience. Which is why I stayed until the very last minute that I could stay there. And anytime I met with somebody and photographed with somebody, it was, we would love to introduce you to this person. And my whole idea behind this was, if it ended up just appearing on the surface to be a story from one perspective, then it's only going to have an audience. It's only going to have one audience, and it's not going to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish with this, which is helping people, or allowing people to kind of empathize with people who they think they just inherently are going to disagree with. So I made it so that it would be impossible to do that, and why I essentially didn't, like, I wanted to just do this as self-directed, so that I didn't have anybody telling me, this is the story, or these are the people we want you to speak to. So my goal is to with this is to create a body of work, and I'm still working on how to frame this. I need to be very careful about it, so that it doesn't appear to be made for a specific audience or have a specific agenda other than creating empathy and understanding. But I wanted to make it so that it has a story that anybody could identify with. But when you feel like you can identify with something, then it kind of like opens you up to see the humanity in somebody who you also might feel you disagree with. Whereas if it were just, a story by a, specific author, or in a specific publication, or with a specific title, or about a certain community, everybody who thinks in this day and age, the phenomenon is everybody who thinks they'd likely not appreciate or not agree with what that article or what that documentary has to say, they just won't read it. They just won't look at it. They just won't open it up, because people don't want to be challenged. I think it's impossible with this body of work. My goal is to make it impossible for somebody to not see a different perspective, because they're going to recognize perspectives that they can connect with, but they're also in that process going to see perspectives that they might have not engaged with before. So that was my goal with this body of work: essentially open people up to different perspectives and different experiences. And I think, unfortunately, people just automatically don't want to be challenged, because it inconveniences their narrative that they're putting out into the world, and people don't want to be challenged, and people are seeing this specific conflict as very black and white.
I'd love to, if possible. I mean, I know you're still working on it. You probably took a million photos when you were there, and you've only been back for
Yeah.
2 weeks. But I'd like to, if possible, like show some of the pictures that you're talking about that challenge ideas and that kind of encapsulate, what you're talking about on this podcast. I'm also curious if you think having taken a bunch of photos, and are there any photos in particular that you took that you think kind of are able to achieve this, that are able to bring people in that wouldn't otherwise be engaged in these issues, and why do you think these images are particularly effective?
Yeah. So, like, getting back to the point about context, the images themselves, no, they're just images of people. But an image with a story, yes. And I think, like I said before, it's impossible for just one image to stand alone for this. That you need to see, I would need to see, like, every photo would have to have, first of all, like, the context, and the, story behind it, the individual's story that they shared with me, um, but also a, not necessarily juxtaposing, but a different set of experiences from somebody else, as like a diptych or a triptych, or you have two stories or three stories, next to each other, because that's the whole point of this piece. So, um, I'd want to put, the Palestinian activists in the West Bank, portrait and story, and the photos that are most. I've taken all these photos and photos of destruction and violence and trauma, but I actually think the more I look at these photos and the more I think about this story, it's more just about, like, people, and I want to show the people because their experiences are more valuable and important than just like a destroyed home. It's the person
Mm-hmm.
whose home this was, whether that's, a Palestinian's home in Hebron in the West Bank, or an Israeli's home that was destroyed, by Hamas on October 7th in Kibbutz Be'eri or Kfar Aza. So I'd want to, share those stories in direct relation, to each other. And I think that's what makes this story, um, a powerful one, that people have experienced these same things, but are just not communicating, with each other. And this whole experience just reinforced my belief that people want the exact same thing, essentially, which is peace, security, equality. Everybody has different ideas about how to get there, and that's what the real conflict is about. But I think if people started to, like, really fundamentally believe that, realistically, these two groups of people aren't going anywhere and we both want the same thing, let's figure out how to get to that destination. If we framed it like that, I think the outcome, would be different, and we wouldn't necessarily be seeing this widespread destruction, violence, um, that we're seeing, you know, in in Gaza, and, what we saw in Israel, right now. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's my goal.
You you said that you spend a lot of time just meeting with lots of different groups that are a part of um, it's a part of the conflict in the region. Israel and the Levant is a very diverse area. I'm curious if there were any. I'm sure you had a lot of impactful encounters. Every encounter is meaningful, but were there any that in particular challenged the ideas that you had going into this? And if possible, like I'd love for you to kind of share some of the experiences that you had that maybe made a big impression on you, or think are worth sharing.
Yeah, so, like, the experiences that I really struggled with, and it was hard again because all of this stuff is very personal for me. And when I'm in the moment, I'm used to being in, difficult and frantic, even dangerous situations as a photographer. And it's kind of like fight or flight, and your adrenaline kicks in. It's like if you played sports, it's like, that in the middle of a soccer match or in the middle of a basketball game, you're not thinking about your next move. You're just reacting and you're going. And that's kind of, and then after the game, you kind of like sit and you do like a post game, recap, and you're replaying all the things you could have done differently, and you're thinking about it, and you're going through it. And that's kind of the way it was in all of these situations in, in Israel and Palestine when I was there this past time, is that afterwards, these experiences were so heavy, but so fast and so experiential that in the moment I didn't have time to think about how it was affecting me. I was just, reacting and asking questions and recording and photographing. But afterwards, it was very, very heavy and it really sat on me. And it's still an experience that's going to be unfolding for a very long time with me. Um, but there were a lot of things that I saw that could have made me really angry. Um, and I had to be very conscious of not allowing my anger to take over and not allowing my anger to change the way that I see people and see the conflict, and um, inform the way I approach this work. And it was challenging because seeing people commit mass acts of violence against other people makes me angry. And whether that's, no matter what group that is, and the justification of violence, it makes me angry. And I had a lot of conversations where I was talking about this with somebody yesterday. I like try to practice radical empathy, like through my work and through in life in general. And what I experienced when I was in Israel and Palestine right now is that so many people are really struggling to empathize with what the other side is going through because they have been victimized in such an acute way themselves, and they are still going through it. Everybody who wakes up in Israel or in Gaza or the West Bank right now, there is an acute cycle of trauma that they're in, and they have PTSD, but they wake up in the morning and it starts fresh again. And there is such a small amount of space for empathy for others right now. And at first, it was really bothering me that in all these conversations I would go to, I would find like a lack of empathy. And it wasn't because of hatred, it was because of so much energy and so much concern was everybody's own families and own communities acute suffering, that there just wasn't like the bandwidth, or there wasn't the
Mm-hmm.
space or the capacity to empathize, not out of cruelty, but out of an inability to. Um, and I realized that I had to empathize. I had to even empathize with everybody's, not everybody, but most people's inability to find empathy in this situation, because the suffering is so massive and so acute for everybody. And it was hard. I've never experienced something like that before. That it's just, I experienced myself needing to understand that people aren't able to understand, or empathize with people who aren't able to empathize at this moment in time. And that was like challenging for me, because I don't want to be a mouthpiece for people who are just who cannot at a certain point see the humanity in somebody else. But that's the reality of the situation. And I realized that, like, I'm trying to do one thing, but at the basis of it, I'm trying to show the truth, and I'm trying to share real emotions and the real story. And somebody's lack of empathy, while like hard to come to terms with, it's also legitimate. So that was a challenge for me as well, and to kind of like maintain my own understanding for all of these people who are really suffering, and are really in crisis, and who really feel like their homes are on fire, and asking them to empathize with the people who set their homes on fire right now might be a little, insensitive on my part, whether that's, an Israeli or a Palestinian. Um, so that was challenging, and it remains challenging. And I think it kind of like reframed the way I think about like who the audience might be from this work. For this work, it might be too raw for Israelis or Palestinians to really take this in right now because they're in such a deep wave of crisis. But for the American public, who I think is largely extremely biased no matter what side they're on and are not allowing their views to be challenged, that I think is who this like body of work is really for people who have just kind of like accepted and adopted a certain way of thinking about this conflict without trying to empathize with how people on quote unquote the other side are feeling or what they're going through, their experiences, um, because either they don't really have a deep understanding of the history of the conflict or the current dynamics of the conflict or the culture, or the experiences, but they're so vocal and loud about their beliefs in the situation that I think it's making things much worse for the people who are actually living it. So I want to create understanding for the people who are, surrounding the conflict, because it seems like everybody has an opinion on it,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people's opinions are extremely biased, um, towards towards either side, and it's doing it's making things a lot harder to reconcile for the people who are actually living this conflict day to day.
Yeah. On the more human side, I'm curious, like, what does that trauma really look like? People are going through it in Israel and in Palestine. Like, what did you see? What are these people experiencing? How did they interact with you? And like, maybe you can share and try to articulate kind of the emotional side of, you know, what people are dealing with there.
Yeah, it's it goes beyond emotion. I think it goes beyond emotion. I mean, there's Gaza and Israel might as well be 5,000 miles apart. I don't really think people in Israel fully comprehend what life is like in Gaza or what's happening in Gaza. And I don't think people in Gaza understand, what it's like for the way Israelis feel, about their own security. Sorry, what was the actual question?
I'm just curious, like, what I'm trying to get at is I think people in the United States, they see this on the news, and a lot of people, they box it in as another conflict. It's like Ukraine. It's like, oh,
Right,
there are people dying. This is really bad. They can engage with it on a cerebral level, but
right.
it's very hard for people to engage with it on an emotional level. And
Yeah,
I think it's worth spending a little bit of time like talking about like what does this actually look like when thousands of people were killed in a day, their loved ones, their houses were burned. And on the other side, when, what the Palestinians are going through, when their homes are being destroyed and when people are dying, innocent people are dying, what is that? What does that emotion look like? How do they deal with it when you interact with them? What is going through their mind? How do they behave to you? Like, what is
yeah,
that state of mind like? If you can try and articulate it, I'm curious.
yeah. It's this palpable feeling and topic where every single discussion can't finish until it essentially like melts away to what's happening underneath, and what's happening underneath is this conflict. You can have conversations about, I had regular everyday conversations about, you know work and relationships and love and life and sports, but at the end of every conversation, whether it was the start of every conversation, it always kind of melts away to the conflict, and it's this just like acute sense of trauma, that everybody is living with, and for some people it's at the very forefront, and for some people it's just below the surface. For some people it's their entire life right now because they have, a loved one who was murdered, or they have, a loved one who is still, um, is still, captive in Gaza, or they're, they have, I didn't get to go into Gaza, but it's, you speak to Palestinians and it's, they feel extremely unsafe, and they feel like their lives are not valued, and they feel like their lives are in danger any day of the week. So it's this acute sense of of generational trauma that has just the scabs been ripped open, for Israelis and for Palestinians. And Palestinians, they are in constant fear for their safety, fear for their lives, depending on where they live. It's a very important point also. Um, and Israelis, they feel the same. I think Israelis, like you speak to Israelis and they say they fear for their lives also. I think, just based on like raw numbers in this particular conflict, um, life is more dangerous and more violent for Palestinians, right now. Um, so I think their fears are a little different. Where, in Gaza it's just day to day trying to stay alive. Um, in Israel, it's trying to, stay alive, but also dealing with conflict, and it's parents who don't want to send their kids to a war that they don't really understand the purpose of, and they didn't feel like they wanted in the first place. And the country was essentially, um, in Israel, was protesting in the streets, the biggest protest in the history of Israel, against the Israeli government for the past year. I have a lot of photos of that from this past summer that I could share with you too, against Netanyahu, against his right wing government, against the inequality, societal level inequality that that he's uh, that he's guiding for the country. Um, and People are angry. Israelis are angry. That's probably the main emotion that I feel right now. They're angry at their own government, for essentially feeling like, essentially feel like they were abandoned. A lot of people feel like, this right wing government in Israel was too concerned with building um, illegal settlements and um, protecting these settlements that were, shouldn't have been there in the first place, that they didn't have the defense resources or bodies in the right place on a border with Gaza, on the border with Hamas, to be able to protect the people who are most vulnerable. So Israelis are angry at, the Israeli government for failing them, but they're also obviously angry at Hamas, and Hamas has been very clear about, what their objectives are from day one. It's in their charter, destruction of Israel. Um, but obviously they're angry at, they want, Hamas to be, wiped off the map. They don't want innocent Palestinians to die. There are some Israelis who just see, people in Gaza as all Hamas. There's extreme. I'm not going to lie. Like there's extremity on both sides. There's Palestinians who see any Israeli Jew who lives in Israel as an occupier, and um, committing violence against them as an act of resistance, not an act of, violence. And there's Israelis who see any Gazan as, having democratically elected Hamas, that they get lumped into the same, boat as Hamas. So they're not even seen as civilians. But very few Israelis want innocent Palestinians to die. I think everybody across the board feels like Hamas is never going to be a tenable partner for peace. And I think most people realistically understand that, like, you can't kill an ideology, and Hamas is more an ideology than a political movement. And Netanyahu's approach to how they're trying to end this conflict and create peace is doesn't make any sense and is completely backwards. And tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians are dying as a result, and thousands of innocent Israelis have already died, and hundreds of Israeli 18, 19, 20-year-olds are being sent off to a war that people don't really see the purpose of. And, being kind of led into the abyss by the by the Israeli politicians who allowed this situation to occur in the first place, who so much of the country was rallying against before any of this happened. So there's a lot of anger, is one of the main emotions, and the anger is spread very thin. Israeli society is divided. Um, Israelis are angry. Israelis are in trauma, and Palestinians also have. It's more like Palestinians have felt this anger and this oppression for a long time, and now it's just rather than just being in certain places occupied and having their homes taken, now it's their homes are being destroyed and their families are being annihilated. So they're I think you're scared first because day to day in a place like Gaza, you're just trying to stay alive. Um, so yeah, but everybody feels something different. If you're a mother whose son is, if you're an Israeli mother whose son is 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 a Israeli soldier in Gaza right now, you wake up every morning and you're scared. If you're, a concert goer, from the Nova Festival, whose best friends were killed before your eyes, on October 7th, you're traumatized and sad and angry. If you're, a father in Gaza trying to protect his, family, your mother in Gaza trying to protect her family, you wake up every morning and you're terrified and you're angry that Israel is bombing you, and you're angry that Hamas essentially kicked the hornet's nest on October 7th. And if you're a Palestinian in the West Bank, you're angry that you're living within a fence and that your neighbor's house got occupied by the IDF, and that you can't, you need to go past 5 checkpoints just to go to the doctor. And there's just people are really living in just a constant state of extreme emotional turmoil, and every day that emotion is whatever emotion that is different.
Yeah. I saw on your Instagram that you were one of the people who, the Israeli government has kind of collected and amalgamated a bunch of footage from
Yeah.
the massacre that Hamas perpetuated on Israel on October 7th, and you were able to see that footage. I'm curious, like at a higher level or more of a descriptive level, like because I don't understand. Like I think despite how horrible these images are, my personal opinion is that people should see what this looks
I
like,
agree.
what happens. And I'm curious if you could, because a lot of, unfortunately, like you can see some stuff on Twitter, but a lot of these images have not been made public. I'm curious if you could just describe kind of what you saw and like how this kind of experience informed the way that you view, what's going on there.
Yeah, I don't know if it really changed um, the way I see what's going on there, because like the evidence of what had happened is pretty clear, and I had spoken with people who experienced it firsthand. So like I wasn't surprised to see what I saw, but I was at the same time just seeing it was shocking. I've never seen footage like that. Um, it was 47 minutes. I mean, and I went to a military base. I had to get in touch with the IDF spokesperson's unit, and I went to a military base and had to. It was me and 9 or 10 members of parliament from the UK.
Hmm.
Um, and first, we saw all of like the materiel that Hamas had essentially left behind in Israel after October 7th, and it was RPGs, and it was unexploded grenades, and it was motorcycles, and it was It was suicide drones and all of these things that, we saw them first, all of the guns, everything. And then we saw the film, and I had to lock up my camera. I had to lock up my phone. I had to sign a waiver saying that I wouldn't record anything, but I had pen and paper, and I just took notes on everything that I was seeing, and it was just frantic. I took like 5 pages of scratch notes over the 47 minutes. It was the most depraved thing by far that I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like that in my life. I mean, it was firsthand, essentially like body cam and cell phone footage, mostly from Hamas themselves, like that had been captured from Hamas fighters on October 7th, where they were essentially recording, whether it was on a GoPro or just their cell phone or a movie camera, whatever it was, the things that they were doing. Or it was from CCTV footage, which that was probably like the smallest amount. And then there was video from like Israelis' cell phones also, um, who were recording their friends dancing at the Nova Festival, and then you see and hear shots, or they were in their car, they're hiding in a bomb shelter or a bunker, and they're like recording videos because they don't know what's going to happen and they want some sort of like record for people to see. Um, so that's what the footage is, and it's basically like the only way to describe it is like they went hunting people for sport. Um, there's no like nice or diplomatic way to say it. They were overjoyed and elated in killing civilians, killing killing people, killing women, children, men, young, old. They it was like killing for sport. They, I mean, like the most impactful ones that I think will like stick with me for a really long time. This is like I pretty much broke down right after I saw this. Um, at first, it was just kind of whoever they. I didn't think they realized that it would take the IDF so long to respond, and they ended up having a lot more time to kind of like take their time with like Israeli captives and torture and torment. I think their goal in the beginning was just, we're going to get in, we're going to kill as many people as possible and get out, or just we'd be engaged in a firefight with the IDF like pretty immediately, and that didn't happen for hours and days in some places. um, so it started out just shooting anybody on the road who they encountered, um, literally just shooting into cars. And then it was, um, you saw CCTV footage and them going into individual houses um, on the kibbutzim, the villages that they attacked. One of them that really stuck with me was on a CCTV. You saw two young brothers, are probably like 8 and 10 years old, and their dad. It was very early in the morning, so they were all like in their pajamas, running like through the kitchen, through their like little backyard, into like their bomb shelter, which is to the side. And then you see these two Hamas fighters jump over the fence and just throw a grenade into the bomb shelter. And then you see the dad's body fall covered in blood, and then the kids come out and they're like in shock, and the kids are covered in blood. The kids walk back into the kitchen, and they're just sitting there and in shock. And one kid goes, "Is this real? Is this real? I can't believe," like, and the other, his brother, saying to him, "Yes, it's real." And he's like blinded, his eye was blown out, and his brother was taking care of him. And then this Hamas fighter just comes in and starts rummaging through their fridge, and just starts like chugging a bottle of Coke from the fridge and tells them to just like sit down and shut up. And the kids are frantic. And then you see on the CCTV footage, eventually like the kibbutz security comes, and the mom comes with the security team from the kibbutz, and she sees that her husband had been blown up, and that her two sons had run away, and they actually survived. Um, and um, and then you see I mean, there's so much. You saw one that really stuck with me was there was like a group of maybe like 10 Israeli girls, like 18, 19 years old, hiding in what looked like almost like where they keep like cows. It was just like look kind of like a big like tin iron building, whatever. Um, and they were hiding there. And then all of a sudden, this Hamas, terrorist comes in, and they go, "Oh my God, who is that? Who is that?" They didn't know what was going on, and they were filming, themselves. And then you see, they're getting yelled at, and then a few minutes later, you see footage of from a Hamas cell phone or camera of in this exact same room. Um, Basically, all of these women are covered in blood, but half of them are lying dead on the ground, who had clearly just been sexually assaulted because they had blood coming from between their legs, and clearly victims of rape. And the Hamas fighters are kind of just like going around, like one guy's going around with a camera and just like interviewing all of his friends, and you see these 4 or 5 Israeli girls just covered in blood. Their friends are lying dead on the floor. They you have to assume they had just seen get raped in front of their eyes, and who knows what happened to these other women. Um, and you see them going around, and it reminded me, like what I wrote down. It reminded me of like a locker room after like after a sports game. These guys are just kind of like sitting there. They were young guys. They look exhausted. They had the Hamas headbands. They had guns, and they were just kind of like sitting there smoking cigarettes, um, talking to their commanders, and just kind of like saying like, we're here, you know, Alhamdulillah, and we're here to set Gaza free and kill Israelis and etc. That really stuck with me. Another one was this story came out recently. There were 2 decapitations in this video. One was one that was like pretty popular going around Telegram, where it was like a Thai worker that they basically like decapitated him with a shovel or some sort of garden tool. And then another one, which I think is probably what was in the news recently, where they were selling a decapitated IDF soldier's head for like $10,000. They were trying to sell it in Gaza. That I was actually surprised that they actually showed it. They have more footage that they didn't show because they think it would be too traumatizing, but like that the IDF didn't show because they think it'd be too traumatizing of sexual assault. But this one, some Hamas terrorists like took out a knife that was like the size of like a big steak knife and just chopped off this dead IDF soldier's head, and then called his commander, or called his commander before, and you hear his commander say, "Bring it back to Gaza. We're gonna let the kids kick it around like a soccer ball in the street." Um, and then the last one that really stuck with me, I would say, like I'm sure more I could recount everything, but another one that really stuck with me was, I think it was on an army base. I wasn't sure exactly where it was. It wasn't clear, but there were 3 or 4 young girls. They might have been like young IDF soldiers who were hiding under a table in a room that had been like already shot up and destroyed, and they were like in shock. And 2 Hamas terrorists walk in and say, "Hey, I found a few more. I found a few more. Bring your camera, and like bring your phone. Like record this." And they shot a few of them under the table, and either they weren't killed immediately or the guy didn't get a good shot. So the other guy said to him, like, "Hold on, I didn't get a good shot. Pull them out. Let's do that again." And this happened at a few different points where they were like, they found somebody hiding, and they were like, they called their friend over to say, "Hey, record this." So they like pulled out these 3 or 4 like 18, 19-year-old girls. And the guy, like, it was like a director, the guy who was holding the phone, the camera, was like, "Pull them out, like put the light on them, and like shoot them in the back of the head. And you saw this, like you saw them shoot these kids in the back of the head and then record it and celebrate it and like leave a message for their friends and parents. Like, hey mom, hey dad, look what I did. Um, None of this, again, none of this is surprising because Hamas has been very clear about how they feel about Israelis and what their intentions were, and they were live streaming this themselves for the world to see. So none of this was surprising that they did this, but at the same point, it was still extremely shocking as a human being to see this happen to other, for human beings to so easily do this to other human beings is, it's shocking, it's terrifying. And on a personal level, as you know, being a Jewish person who has a lot of friends and some family in Israel, these are people that you know, who I'm seeing being executed. These are literally friends of friends. These are people who my friends know, and it's too hard for Israelis to see it. And to your point earlier, I do think that this should be shared as hard as it is. I asked like the spokesperson's unit, why don't you share this? Because, you know, people need to see what happened, and people are even questioning, even people like after I shared, like, I haven't really shared what I saw, but when people are denying what happened, I feel like I have to speak up and say, you,
Mm-hmm.
like, it's undeniable. I've seen it with my own eyes. If you trust me as a person, if you trust me as a journalist, if you trust me as a photographer, trust me when I say I saw these things happen with my own eyes. Um, so it's been very frustrating to see a lot of people try to deny that this happened, and they wouldn't be able to deny it if Israel
Yeah.
decided to release this footage. And when I said that to the spokesperson's unit, they basically just said it's too traumatizing for Israelis. And I spoke about this because this was kind of like pretty early on in my time there. I spoke to Israelis, and across the board, every single one of them said they would never ever watch it. They'd never be able to see it. So the IDF is actually like protecting the minds of Israelis by not sharing this. Although that I think it would be extremely helpful for their case, for their cause, for their, you know, I hate to say it like this, but for their PR as it relates to this war, because so many people don't believe that these things actually happen to Israelis, and just see Israelis as, and Israel as the sole aggressors.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that that's accurate, and I don't think that that's fair. And it kind of like, to your point, it kind of ladders back to a conversation that we had at ICP um, earlier this year in the fall about whether or not um, it's actually about it comes back to work that Teju Cole and Susan Sontag. I can share more of their work with you later, you know, as a result, as it relates to this, about the suffering of others, about how comfortable people in the West, in America, are seeing our how comfortable we are, and how commonplace it is to see suffering and violence perpetrated against people in different parts of the world, especially those, you know, who are coming from, you know, the developing world, especially people with brown and black skin. We're used to seeing suffering for them, but we're not used to seeing white Westerners have violence perpetrated against them, or suffering on the same level. And we have to ask ourselves why we're comfortable seeing these images and these videos of violence and 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 struggle and trauma with these other populations, but not within our own. Why it's too disturbing for our own, but we're okay with it with others. And that conversation kind of got elevated to the conversation of school shootings in the States, where it's obviously like an epidemic that we have here. And one thing that we never do is share photos of school shootings. No American in the public has ever seen the photos of an aftermath of a school shooting. We've never seen a photo of a dead kid after a school shooting. We've never seen even what the classrooms look like, because it would be too disturbing for Americans. So the media just doesn't show it. But I do think that we should show it. And as terrible as it seems, as traumatizing as it would be for the people who went through it and the communities who lived it, I think it would really, on a more macro level, prevent it from happening on the level that it happens. Again, images are way more powerful than descriptions and just words. And I think if Americans saw the raw images of school shootings, I think it would be impossible to not act. And we've sat on our fucking hands when it comes to, gun violence and access to guns and school shootings in the States. And I think if more Americans saw and experienced what that actually looks like, then it'd be impossible not to take more extreme measures to combat it. And I think that, and a lot of people disagree with me, to be honest, but as like a social justice activist and photographer, I do think that we should just bite the bullet and share these images. And I think as it relates to this particular conflict, I think these images and photos need to be shared. I mean, there's a risk that they're used as a there's a risk that they're used as a means to make people angry and for people to go out and cause more violence and aggression towards the others. But Israelis all know what happened because it happened to them specifically. So I don't think that that's at great of a risk. I don't think those videos are going to cause Israelis to go out and want to become more violent and want to go perpetrate more acts of violence against Palestinians. Not that they need any help to do that right now. But I think it would change the narrative throughout the rest of the world, where Israel and Israelis are not seen as having been victims in this at all. And I don't really think like what happened on October 7th is actually a part of the narrative anymore. And by October 9th or 10th, it wasn't really even part of the narrative anymore. And I think it's important to understand that the suffering that Israelis and Jews and Israel went through, and to really understand that when you're saying ceasefire now, and I want a ceasefire, but when you're saying ceasefire now and it's just directed at Israel, you also have to understand that the people who are on the other side of this ceasefire are violent terrorists. And if you saw what happened on October 7th, you might try to put out a more constructive argument than just calling for a ceasefire without any actual ideas about how to like create an actual like lasting peace or lasting ceasefire, because you have one party who has basically agreed to never have a ceasefire. So
Yeah, well said.
I think that would be important for like the overall understanding of the actual dynamics of the situation.
Yeah, and I'm curious. Like, I have a few more questions before we wrap this thing up. But you've had this experience at this in this very contentious uh, time in our recent history, and in Poland and Israel. I'm curious. I mean, you showed me a picture of your grandparents when we first started out, and you talked about how you wanted to go to Poland to kind of document, the I guess the Holocaust is no longer about to be living. We have some people that are still living that have gone through the Holocaust, but
Right.
in a few years that will no longer be the case. Um, I'm curious, having these experiences in Poland and Israel, if you could speak a little bit about, what it is honestly like in your life to have grown up, a descendant of people that survived the Holocaust, and kind of how that shapes the way that I don't know how that shapes the way that you kind of. I mean, it seems like you said that you're a humanist. You care about engaging in these issues. I'm just
Yeah.
curious. I mean, I think first of all, like, I think we should talk more about people that have had these experiences, what these experiences are like. So I want to, as you went to Poland to kind of document this while it's still alive, I'd love to hear about what it was like, or what it was like to grow up with parents or grandparents that survived the Holocaust, and kind of how it, if at all, has shaped the way that you kind of engage with photography and what you do.
Yeah, fully. I mean, 100%. My entire like family life upbringing was rooted in, our family suffered greatly, came to this country as refugees. My mom's parents too, they came, because of pogroms and um, essentially not being able to live as Jews in the Soviet Union, and around the turn of the century, and they wanted to be able to live freely, so they came to the States in the 20s and 30s. On my mom's side, and my parents' side, they came. My dad's side, they came in the 40s and 50s, but they were spread out everywhere. I mean, my dad's family and my aunts and uncles' family, some wound up in New York, some wound up in Montreal, some wound up in Argentina, some wound up in Brazil, some wound up in Israel, all over, wherever we could go. So that like experience of losing everything and being a refugee and having to start, fresh, somewhere new, and getting to that new place, and being seen as a second class citizen at first, it it really has kind of like colored my entire experience to approach to, my work, my life, and as a result, my photography. My family is hyper conscious, and I think my community is hyper conscious of um, other people's experiences who have gone through certain things, and we tend to are constantly be putting we tend to constantly put our experience into a modern context. And now that we're in a position where we're not, in New York, we don't feel like we're really like the victims, where we're in a position to help other communities who are um, going through similar, tribulations, to be able to help wherever we can. Um, and I think that's kind of like a value, an ideal that's inherent in my family, and in my community, at least. Having been through something like that, having overcome, just in my grandparents' generation, a scenario like that, a situation like that. How can we, take that experience? How can we use the position that we're in now, to prevent that from happening to other communities, to uplift of other communities? We think of ourselves as a minority community, although we've done, like the Jews have done like quite well for themselves in America. We still think of ourselves as a minority community, I think, and um, one that can empathize and relate to other minority communities quite well. So I think it's a family value, it's a community value. I think it's a Jewish value to be um, to basically like put yourselves out there, to dedicate your life to helping others where possible who have gone through similar circumstances, and to use whatever like privilege and whatever power you might have to create better social dynamics for the world, and to improve outcomes for human rights wherever it's possible.
When you were in Poland and Israel, I'm curious, like what emotions were coming up when you were having these experiences, and also like curious if you were able to, if you felt more connected to your relatives, um, after experiencing these things.
Yeah, definitely. um I mean, I'd been to Poland before, um and I'd been to a bunch of the I'd been to 3 or 4 different concentration camps. I'd been to Treblinka and Auschwitz and Majdanek and one more. Um, and I went with a big group when I was in high school, and it was just about, trauma and tragedy and history. And then when I was there myself this past time, I actually kind of got to like slow down and see what life actually might have been like, and walk the same streets, and it was a much more personal experience, because it wasn't about just like the broad Polish Jewish experience, or the broad Jewish experience during World War II in Europe. It was about my own family's experience, and it felt very like it felt very personal, and it felt very. I've never had a connection to Poland, like the place Poland. My grandparents are from there. They spoke Polish. They were born there. You know, the way that an Italian American in New York feels a strong sense of their Italian heritage. I feel zero of that for Poland, and my grandparents are from there. I feel a very strong connection to like I don't identify as Polish. I identify as Jewish or Ashkenazi Jewish. So that's like where my cultural touch points are. But to feel this culture that my family was in, experienced in a place like Krakow was really powerful. And I felt it almost felt like I didn't really feel like a tourist there. It felt like a place I had been before. It felt like a place where it just felt familiar to me. It felt like the origins of you could see the origins of New York, Eastern European, like now the Eastern European Jewish culture in New York, which is a big part of the culture in New York. You could see kind of like the origins where it came from, in the food, in the music, in the architecture, um, and that was really interesting to see, and it felt kind of like a homecoming to a certain extent.
Hmm.
And I felt very comfortable in Krakow, whereas the last time I was in Poland, I felt very uncomfortable and very unwelcomed. Um, and then when I went to my grandfather's village, like I mentioned, it's like a 3-hour drive away from Krakow. It's just I expected it to be, and this is probably just like my own like preconceived bias about what Poland actually looks like. I expected it to be like a rundown, disheveled, one horse town. And it was a modern, bustling town on a beautiful river, the Vishla River. It was industrial. It was great infrastructure. It was full of life. There were kids. There were schools, libraries, restaurants, trees, parks, and it was modern and beautiful. And I don't know what I was really expecting because my whole idea of like shtetl life is like what I've seen in photos and what my grandfather shtetl's like the old Jewish like community, and what I'd seen in like Fiddler on the Roof, and for some reason it had just been like these areas had just been frozen in time, and I don't know what I expected to see, but I saw a very modern, bustling town. And the only relic, like I mentioned, in 1939, I think there were like 6,400 Jews there, which was like 60% of the population. And now there's not as much as a statue or a monument or a plaque to the Jewish community who once lived in this town, who once, were the leaders of this town, who once, gave this town its spirit, its culture. All there was a cemetery that I had to hop a fence to get into. It wasn't like there was no gate to get in. There was nobody visiting this cemetery. There's no local society of people who upkeep it. And this is the story of thousands of villages in Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine and all over Europe and all over where Jewish communities once were, and in Marrakesh and Damascus and Beirut and in Baghdad and in Algiers and Alexandria and Cairo. So it's a familiar story, but I think it'd probably be very similar in all of these places. There's not much of a recognition of its Jewish history. There might be small little relics that you can find here and there. And that's what I experienced. And being in that town actually made me quite uncomfortable
Hmm.
because it felt so distant. And I expected to go there and feel a sense of connection because it's where my grandfather spent the first, 14, 15 years of his life. But it was very hard to find any connection to this place where I just completely was looked at and felt like a complete outsider. And all history of Jewishness and culture had been completely erased or destroyed, whether that was, you know, deliberate or just, the when the Germans came. But it was that was quite an eerie feeling. And to be honest, actually like to go back and spend more time and do a little bit more discovery, just to see if there's more to it that I'm missing, that I missed. So yeah, I think I'll go back eventually. And it was beautiful, to be honest with you.
Hmm.
So that was another part of it.
Amazing, man. Last question for you. I think in 2024, yeah, we're recording this on January 28th, 2024. I think my feeling is that, when it comes to writing, when it comes to photography, and honestly, when it comes to like ideas, I think that it's hard to find like original voices. I think a lot of people um, subscribe to kind of like templatized ideas that have been sold to them on like TV or news, and I'm curious like how you go about. I think good art, true art, and good ideas are very much authentic and unique, and are able to explore nuance that these more kind of generic ideas that most people engage with are not able to do. And I'm curious like how how have you been able to, as a photographer, how have you been able to find your voice? um, I'd love to kind of hear about the process, because I think a lot of people uh, are unable to find their own voice.
Yeah, I think that's something that most photographers, like you mentioned, really writers, photographers really struggle with. And I'm a chameleon and a maximalist when it comes to life, and that really is exhibited in photography. And I think it's like I'm slowly figuring out exactly what that voice is, because honestly, like, to be, at least to get your start in photography, you need to carve out a very specific voice for yourself. You need to carve out a specific style, subject matter, themes, um, so that you're not just horizontal, surface level um, observer, but you're a real, you want to be a researcher. You want to be an author with the camera. You want to be a thinker. You want to go deep. Um, and I think the thing that I definitely think is my voice is this connection to people, and my ability to understand people, and my ability to help people share their own story in a in a meaningful and humanistic way. And I think that's what my approach will be, is allowing people to be their authentic selves and to tell their stories. And I tend to identify with people who have been through some sort of trauma or have overcome some sort of hardship. And I look for those stories because I think those people and those stories are the most important ones to tell, because they give the people who read them and who see them the confidence and the strength to see that somebody else has been through something difficult. This is a story that I can identify with, and it gives me strength. um or this is a through photography, through a lens, this is a different culture or a different group of people who I didn't know I had so much in common with, or I didn't know I was interested in. And it forces people to, when you see somebody as a neighbor or as somebody as familiar, you're so much less likely to wrong them, to see them as less than. And I think it's really important for people to in a city like New York, especially, to be able to see their neighbors beyond just people who live in a different neighborhood. Or this group of people are the bus drivers, and this group of people are the delivery workers, and these group of people are the lawyers, and these group of people are the doctors. But to see the humanity and to see the stories and to value the culture, and that no one piece of like the fabric, or no one piece of the tile of the mosaic of New York City is more important than the rest, that it's all part of this overall mosaic, it's all part of this overall quilt. And without each of these pieces standing on their own and being celebrated and being respected and being dignified, the whole city is not as strong and your community is not as strong. So that's my goal, and that's kind of what led me to Sundance this past week. Actually, was well, my sister and her husband have been going for a long time, and it's always kind of been on my radar. And they told me to come this year, and I wanted to find a good reason to come because I had to miss a couple seminars, and it's not cheap. I had to fund this myself, but there's this gym in the Lower East Side around the corner from me called Body. It's like it's a workout class, like a Barry's boot camp, started by this guy named Cos Marte. He's from the Lower East Side. He is formerly incarcerated individual, ex-convict, um, who had been in prison for about 6 years, and got in really good shape while he was in prison, on doctor's orders, basically, and started doing workout classes for other guys in prison. And when he came out, he basically said, I'm coming back to Lower East Side. I'm living on my mom's couch. I destroyed this neighborhood before, which is how I end up in jail. Now I want to uplift this neighborhood. So he started doing these workout classes, and they got bigger, and they eventually rented a space in a basement in the Lower East Side, and then they got kicked out, and they he hires only formerly incarcerated individuals to be trainers at the gym and to work at the gym. So he creates these pathways for employment. Combody creates these pathways for employment, and there was a film crew following them for basically 8 years from after he got out of prison to where they are now. This big marquee gym in the Lower East Side. And I got in touch with them in person in the Lower East Side before we went out to Sundance, and I connected with them in Sundance, and we did a lot of photos, and I heard their story, and I saw the film, and now it's become much more than just a personal success story and a personal um, a personal reinvigoration of one's life. He's really invigorated an entire community of formerly incarcerated individuals and the community of the Lower East Side writ large. So um, it's not just about keeping people healthy, but it's about combating recidivism. And he's done really incredible work, and they're creating pathways for people who are in prison to come out and have a pathway to employment. And it's also people who come from different communities and come to this gym who have an idea of what an ex-convict or a formerly incarcerated individual looks like, or how they're supposed to behave, or how they're supposed to interact with them, and changing their views on this, and then going and sharing it. So that's the type of work that I want to be doing. That's the type of work that I'm really passionate about, sharing these kinds of stories, and uplifting this kind of work, so that people challenge their own worldviews, and start to empathize with other people that they thought they might not have as much in common with, or they thought whose experience or life story might not be as valued or valuable or as important as their own.
That's awesome, man. Uh, do you have anything coming up? Any shows or anything like that? And where can
Yeah,
people
so
find you?
we have a big exhibition at the ICP Museum, starting at the end of May. That'll be up all summer. Um, it's kind of up in the air, um, what exactly um, my final project is going to look like. I have a lot of material, and I think what I realized is that it's going to not just be about. Before, it was going to be like my own family's history, overcoming trauma, and but I think it's now going to be more about how I have used my family's history and trauma to also tell the stories of all these other people who have used art, in whatever form it's in, to overcome trauma, to tell a story, to create empathy, to share with the world, um, and and just go from there. I want people to see more people and really see and understand more people. So that's a goal of my project. and even before my own family's history, which is also very broad, and my own community's history, which is very broad, it was going to be about how diaspora communities in New York contribute to the overall cultural fabric of New York City, and each diaspora community's relationship with their homeland and how they express their culture from their homeland through a New York context. And I think this project is kind of coming full circle back to that, because rather than focus on these things as a community level, I'm going to focus it more um, on these people. I focus more on culture on an individual level. How do individuals express their own specific culture rather than on a community level? And I was going to do it with the Jewish community and the Puerto Rican community in New York. Those are two very like prominent communities here. I spend a lot of time in Puerto Rico. My grandparents retired there. I have a lot of friends there. My family has a place there. It's a place very close to my heart that doesn't get the attention it deserves and gets abused by the U.S. government. So I wanted to kind of like elevate that, story as well, and elevate awareness about Puerto Rico as well. So I think it'll come back to that as well. So I was in Puerto Rico shooting in December, so I think some of that will probably be part of the work too. And the New Yorican community also will be a part of this body of work. But it'll be up on the wall at ICP in May. But it's a body of work that I think is going to be my general life's work. So it'll be ongoing.
Awesome, man. I look forward to seeing it.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I'll keep you posted on dates and openings and everything.
Cool, man. Well, this 2 hours and 19 minutes has gone by pretty fast.
Wow,
I
yeah, it has.
appreciate the time, dude. It's been
Yeah, of
great,
course.
and hopefully I'll see you around Brooklyn.
Yeah, for sure, man. If you ever want to grab a beer, just let me know. I'm around.
I look forward to it, man. Awesome.
All right,
Cool.
but thanks.
Have a great rest of your weekend.
Yeah, you too, man.
All right. Take it easy. Bye.